That morning felt different too. Calm too, still, the kind of silence that soldiers learn not to trust. We had walked that same valley 100 times before, same dust, same faces, same sky. It should have been routine in and out before noon, but that day, the valley was watching us. The locals were quiet. No children, no chatter. Even the wind had stopped moving. That is when I knew something was wrong. The blast hit before I could even breathe. The ground opened beneath our feet and the world turned to dust, fire, and chaos. In that moment, everything changed. The mission, the valley, the men beside me, nothing was ever the same again. This is the story of my last patrol in Afghanistan, the day everything changed. There was something strange about that morning, something that didn't feel quite right, even before the first steps of the patrol. The air was cool, sharper than usual, and the light coming over the ridgelines had that pale golden tint that always made the Afghan mountains look peaceful. But it was a deceptive kind of peace, the kind you learned not to trust. After months in the valley, you started to sense when the world went quiet for a reason. Our squad moved out just after dawn. The compound walls behind us faded into the distance, replaced by the open fields and narrow dirt paths we knew too well. We had done this route a dozen times before, maybe more. Same fields, same locals watching from doorways, same uneasy silence after a wave. The kind of silence that made you feel like eyes were everywhere, watching, waiting, remembering. I remember thinking how ordinary it all seemed. The dust on my boots, the hum of the radio, the crunch of gravel under each step. There was comfort in repetition. The mission brief had sounded simple: a short patrol to check in on a nearby village, follow up on some chatter about movement in the hills, and be back before noon. Nothing about it hinted at what would come later. The terrain was unforgiving, rolling hills of dry earth and scattered rock, with patches of green that seemed to grow only where they shouldn't. The kind of land that gave no mercy to those walking across it. The locals called this area the Quiet Valley, though everyone knew quiet didn't mean safe. Quiet was when they were watching you. Quiet was when something was being planned. We moved in formation, each man at his post, each scanning his sector like muscle memory. My mind wandered, the way it does when you're too long on patrol. You start to think about home, the sound of traffic, the smell of rain, the weight of normal life. But then a gust of wind snapped me back, carrying with it a scent I didn't like. Burnt metal. It could have been nothing. It could have been everything. The village came into view about an hour in. Mud brick houses clung to the hillside like they'd been there for centuries. Smoke rose lazily from a few rooftops. Kids watched us from a distance, cautious but curious, the way they always did. It was strange how life went on here, surrounded by danger, wrapped in dust and resilience. These people had seen everything. Armies come and go, promises made and broken, and yet they still found ways to live. Our squad leader gave the signal to hold position near a wall overlooking the valley. From there, you could see everything: the river cutting through the basin, the fields beyond, and the shadowed ridge that always felt like it was staring back. We set up security, checked our sectors, and waited for the interpreters to make contact with a local elder. It was just another day, or so it felt. The radio chatter was light. Command wanted updates every 30 minutes, standard routine. I remember glancing at my watch. It was just past 9 o'clock. The heat hadn't settled in yet, but you could feel it coming. The kind that made your vest stick to your uniform, that made every breath taste like dust. Then, a sudden stillness, the kind that hits you all at once. The laughter of children stopped. The goats in the fields vanished behind walls. Even the wind seemed to pause, a silence so thick it felt alive. Every soldier knows that silence. It's the pause before the world shifts, the pause before something goes wrong. Our squad leader noticed it too. I saw him glance toward the ridge, his hand tightening around his rifle. The radio crackled faintly, just static at first, then a clipped voice from command asking for a status check. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet everything did. and then movement. Just a flicker on the ridgeline, too far to make out, but enough to send a shiver through every man in the squad. The human eye is drawn to motion, and in this land, motion almost always meant trouble. We kept our positions, scanned, waited. The interpreter returned, shaking his head. The locals said nothing. No warnings, no smiles, just eyes that looked through us, as if they already knew what was about to happen. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe less. It's hard to remember exactly how time works in moments like that. Everything slows down, every sound feels louder, the click of a rifle safety, the crunch of a boot shifting in the dirt, and then came the blast, a thunderclap from beneath the earth, violent and final. The ground buckled, dust filled the air, and the world went white. The IED had been buried along the path we'd just crossed. It missed the front of the patrol but caught the middle, right where Corporal Harris had been walking. The shockwave threw me off my feet, my ears ringing, my vision flickering between light and shadow. When the dust cleared, all I could hear was the ringing. No voices, no commands, just that awful, endless tone. Then came the shouting, urgent, panicked, raw. The kin, the kind of shouting that strips a man down to instinct. We scrambled for cover, hearts pounding, weapons raised. The air stung of burnt explosives and dirt. Smoke drifted from the crater, thick and heavy, and through it, I saw what was left of the path. The patrol that had started as routine was gone. In that instant, I knew the day had changed. The quiet morning, the steady rhythm, the illusion of control, it all shattered with that one explosion. Nothing about that valley would ever look the same again. And as we regrouped, the first distant pops of gunfire echoed from the ridge. It wasn't over. It was only beginning. The dust from the explosion still hung in the air when the first bullets cracked overhead. It started as single distant pops, sharp, deliberate, probing. Then came the echoing chorus from the ridge, a storm of sound that filled every inch of the valley. It was an ambush, well coordinated and timed to the second. They had waited for the blast, knowing it would disorient us. The world turned to chaos in an instant. The calm discipline of a patrol became survival. We dove behind walls, into ditches, anywhere that offered even a sliver of cover. The ground shook with every impact as rounds chewed through mud and stone. The sound of ricochets sang around us like angry hornets. I hit the dirt behind a broken wall, the sharp sting of gravel biting into my hands. My ears still rang from the explosion, but training took over where hearing failed. Every motion was instinct. Drop low, locate the threat, return fire. But the ridge loomed too far, its shadows hiding the shooters who knew the terrain like the lines on their palms. Somewhere to my left, I saw movement. Sergeant Valdez sprinting toward the crater, trying to reach whoever had gone down. The blast had torn through the middle of the patrol, and we still hadn't accounted for everyone. The dust made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The smell of burnt explosives mixed with sweat and fear, thick and metallic. We laid down suppressive fire toward the ridge, trying to buy time. The sound of M4s and the deeper thud of the SAW gunner echoed together, a desperate rhythm against the steady, disciplined bursts of the enemy. These weren't panicked shots. They knew where we were. They knew how to pin us. I crawled forward, inching closer to the crater where the explosion had gone off. My hands trembled as I moved, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my entire body. Every breath was heavy with dust. I could hear Harris's name being shouted, though I couldn't tell who was calling. The crater was worse than I imagined. The ground had folded in on itself, creating a pit of torn earth and twisted metal. Harris was there, motionless, his vest shredded, his helmet cracked. He was breathing, barely, but his eyes were half open, unfocused. His rifle lay beside him, covered in blood and dust. Valdez reached him first, his hands working fast, checking for wounds, pressing down where the bleeding was worst. Around them, the firefight continued. Rounds snapping through the air, dirt kicking up in bursts. I remember the look on Valdez's face. Not fear, not panic, but a kind of grim acceptance. The look of a man who's done this too many times before and still isn't used to it. We called for a medic over the radio, but comms were patchy. Static cut through every transmission. The enemy must have known our frequencies. They often did. The valley seemed to swallow the signal, leaving us with fragments of words and the cold reality that help wasn't coming anytime soon. Then came the rockets. Small, improvised launchers hidden somewhere in the hills. The first one landed just short of our position, sending a wave of dirt and debris over us. The next hit closer, tearing into the wall we'd been using for cover. The concussion slammed into my chest like a hammer, leaving me gasping for air. We needed to move, and fast. Staying put meant being buried there. Valdez ordered the squad to fall back toward a small irrigation ditch that led out of the village. It wasn't much, but it offered a narrow path out of the kill zone. Harris was loaded onto a stretcher, pale and barely conscious. The rest of us took turns covering as we dragged him back, step by agonizing step. The firefight didn't let up. Bullets tore into the ground around us, snapping through the air like angry wasps. Every few seconds, the sharp whistle of incoming rounds cut too close, and each one made you wonder if the next was yours. The noise was deafening. Gunfire, explosions, shouted commands, and underneath it all, the low hum of fear we all felt but didn't show. We reached the ditch and slid into it, chest deep in muddy water. It wasn't clean, but it was life. The walls of the ditch shielded us from most of the incoming fire, though rounds still snapped overhead. The squad regrouped there, breath ragged, faces streaked with sweat and dirt. Harris lay between us, his breathing shallow. The medic worked over him, hands steady despite the chaos. It was strange how time worked in those moments. Minutes stretched into hours. The firefight felt endless. Yet when it finally began to fade, it was almost sudden. The enemy fire slowed, then stopped altogether. No retreating figures, no final shots, just silence again. The kind that wasn't peaceful, only hollow. We held our position, waiting for a counterattack that never came. The sun had climbed high by then, baking the valley in heat. Flies buzzed over the cratered earth. The smell of gunpowder lingered like smoke that would never clear. When reinforcements finally arrived, the world looked different. The fields were torn apart, walls crumbled, the ground scarred with craters. What had once been a quiet morning was now a graveyard of broken stone and shattered gear. Harris was still alive when they loaded him onto the medevac. His hand twitched once, reaching out, then went still. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. As the helicopter lifted away, I looked toward the ridge, the same ridge we'd scanned that morning. Somewhere up there, the enemy had melted back into the rocks, faceless and untouchable. We'd see them again or others like them, and the cycle would start all over. The radio crackled again, command confirming we were to return to base, regroup, debrief. But as we walked back through the valley, stepping over the wreckage of what had been our patrol route, every step felt heavier. The silence had returned, but this time it wasn't waiting. It was mourning. And deep down, I knew that something inside me had shifted with that explosion. Something I'd never get back. The air felt heavier after the fight ended, as if the valley itself had absorbed the weight of what had happened. The smell of burnt soil, gunpowder, and iron clung to everything. Even the wind seemed to move slower, carrying that thick, metallic taste of war that never really leaves your tongue. We started the long walk back to base in silence. There were no words that fit the moment, no small talk to break the heaviness. Just the crunch of boots in the dirt, the clatter of gear, and the low hum of radios still spitting static. We were supposed to be out for 4 hours. It had barely been 2. But time felt irrelevant now. The patrol that had begun as routine was over in every way that mattered. The sun bore down hard, turning the dust into a suffocating haze. Each step stirred up clouds that stung the eyes and throat. Our formation was tighter now, closer than usual. We weren't taking chances, not after what just happened. The ridge loomed behind us, quiet again, almost mocking. You could feel eyes on you, even if you couldn't see them. We carried the weight of what we'd left behind. Harris had been flown out by medevac, but the crater, the blood, the twisted metal, all of that stayed in the valley. Each of us carried a piece of it in silence. Every soldier learns to compartmentalize, to lock things away until the job is done. But there's no wall strong enough to hold everything. Some of it always leaks through. As we moved through the narrow trails that cut between the fields, locals began to reappear. Farmers, children, women gathering water from the stream. They watched us with that same unreadable look, a mix of fear, curiosity, and something else. Something that always made you wonder what they knew, what they'd seen, or who they'd spoken to before we came through. A boy stood near the edge of the path, barefoot, his clothes torn, a plastic jug in his hand. He didn't move as we passed. His eyes met mine for a second, calm, almost cold, and then he looked away. I don't know why, but that look stuck with me. Maybe because it was the same look Harris had before the blast. A kind of distant knowing, like he'd already seen the end. The radio came to life again, a burst of static followed by a familiar voice from command. They wanted a sit rep, casualty report, ammunition count, the mechanical rhythm of war. We answered in clipped words, the kind that keep emotion buried under procedure. 1 wounded, evac complete, continuing exfil. The words came out dry, practiced, empty. Our route back took us through a narrow gorge, flanked by rock walls that stretched high on either side. It was the kind of terrain that made you feel trapped, perfect ground for another ambush. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every loose stone made your heart skip. We spread out, moved slow, scanning every ledge. The sun climbed higher, beating down on helmets and rifles, cooking the air until it shimmered. Sweat ran down faces, pooling behind goggles. No one spoke. You could feel the fatigue settling in, not just the physical kind, but the deeper one that seeps into your bones, the kind that comes from seeing too much, too fast. After a while, we reached a clearing where the gorge opened up into a wide plain of dry earth. From there, you could see the outline of the base far off in the distance, a cluster of concrete and razor wire shimmering in the heat. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It just felt distant, unreal. We stopped for a short rest. Weapons checked, water bottles passed around. The medic sat off to the side, staring at the ground where he'd laid Harris only an hour before. He rubbed at a dark stain on his gloves that wouldn't come off. Nobody said anything. We all knew what he was thinking. If we'd moved faster, if the comms hadn't cut out, if the timing had been different. But if doesn't mean much out here. The valley doesn't care about if. When we started walking again, the landscape seemed quieter than before. No sound of birds, no movement in the fields. Just the slow, steady rhythm of boots and breath. The heat distorted the horizon, bending the earth into waves. I remember thinking how strange it was that such a beautiful place could hold so much pain. Halfway back, we passed the remains of an old Soviet outpost, crumbling walls, rusted gun barrels jutting out like bones. A reminder that others had walked this same path long before us, fought their own wars here, and left their ghosts behind. Afghanistan doesn't forget. It just buries things until they're dug up again. As we approached the base perimeter, the sound of generators and distant chatter began to drift through the air. The familiar sight of the HESCO barriers and watchtowers came into view. Home, in the only way a place like that could be called home. The guards on the towers waved us in, their faces tight with the kind of expression that said they already knew something had gone wrong. Inside the wire, the routine started again. Gear checks, ammo counts, medical logs. The normal flow of military life. But nothing about that day felt normal. The dust on our uniforms told its own story, one that would never make it into the reports. We gathered in the debrief room, still coated in grime, helmets off, rifles stacked by the door. The commander's voice was calm but heavy as he went through the checklist. Where, when, how? The words blurred together. My focus drifted back to the ridge, to the moment of silence before the explosion, the feeling that something was wrong. I wondered if we'd missed a sign. We always look for meaning afterward, trying to make sense of chaos, but sometimes there's none to find. When it was over, we filed out one by one. The medic headed straight for the showers. Valdez lingered by the doorway, staring out at the mountains beyond the wire. I walked past him, but his voice stopped me. Not a word, just a quiet exhale. The kind that says more than language ever could. That night, I couldn't sleep. The generators hummed outside the tent, a dull, constant sound. Somewhere in the distance, flares lit up the horizon. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the image of the crater replaying in my mind on a loop. The dust, the blast, Harris's eyes. War changes shape as the days pass. The noise fades, but the images stay sharp. That was the start of it for me. The shift from being a soldier on patrol to being a man trying to hold on to what little sense of self he had left. And though I didn't know it yet, that day's aftershocks would follow me long after we left the valley. Morning came too soon. The sun rose over the Hesco barriers like it always did, indifferent and unfeeling. The light that spilled across the base was the same golden hue that had touched the valley the day before. But it felt different now. Colder somehow, harsher. The kind of light that exposes everything you'd rather not see. The base was awake early, as it always was. The clang of metal doors, the rumble of trucks, the distant calls over radios. Routine held this place together. Wake up, clean your weapon, eat, patrol, repeat. Routine was safety. Routine was control. But after what had happened, that illusion of control had cracked. Word of the ambush spread fast. News like that always did. Soldiers from other units nodded silently as we passed, their eyes lingering a little longer than usual. They didn't ask questions. They didn't have to. Everyone knew that a patrol had gone bad. Everyone knew one of us wasn't coming back. The medevac report came in mid-morning. Harris hadn't made it. He'd flatlined on the flight to Bagram. The message came through in a short, cold burst of radio chatter, delivered like any other update. 1 KIA, notify next of kin. Just words. But behind those words was a man we'd eaten with, joked with, marched beside. A man who'd shared his last cigarette with me only hours before he was gone. The silence that followed the announcement was heavier than any firefight. It wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper, thicker. The kind of silence that seeps into your skin and stays there. We all processed it differently. Some sat alone, heads bowed, saying nothing. Others cleaned their weapons over and over, lost in mechanical motion. Valdez stayed busy, talking logistics, checking gear, acting like the next mission might start any minute. For him, movement was the only way to keep from falling apart. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter by myself. The air was hot, the dust rising with every step. From the guard tower, the valley stretched out endless and unforgiving. I could see the faint scar of the trail we had taken, the same path that had swallowed Harris. From this distance, it looked so small, so harmless. It was strange how the land could look innocent from afar, as if it hadn't just witnessed death. I thought about Harris more than I wanted to. He was the kind of soldier everyone liked, quiet, reliable, always there when you needed him. He'd talked about going home soon, about seeing his brother's new baby, about building a motorcycle when he got out. He was counting down the days. We all were. That night I wrote his name on the inside of my notebook, beneath a list of other names from before. Names I'd promised not to forget. The pages were starting to fill up. I never meant for it to become a list, but that's what it had turned into, a quiet record of loss, one that I carried everywhere. The next morning brought more routine, orders to prepare for another patrol, to move on as if nothing had happened. That was how it worked. The machine never stopped. You could lose someone one day and be out on the same road the next, walking past the same dirt, the same walls, pretending you weren't afraid. But fear was always there. It lived in the back of your mind, a quiet companion that never left. You learned to bury it under discipline, under duty. You told yourself you were fine. You had to. In the mess hall, the noise felt forced. Laughter that didn't sound real. Conversations that died mid-sentence. Every man carried the weight differently, but you could see it in the way we all avoided looking at Harris's empty seat. No one said it out loud, but we all knew. That seat wouldn't be filled again. Later, when the heat started to fade and the base fell quiet, I found Valdez sitting by himself near the edge of the wire. His hands were clasped, his eyes on the mountains. I didn't need to ask what he was thinking. I knew. He'd been the one closest to Harris when the blast hit. The guilt was eating him alive, even if he wouldn't say it. He didn't look up when I approached, and I didn't speak. We just sat there side by side, watching the sun dip behind the ridge. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy, but it was shared. That mattered. Sometimes silence was the only language that made sense out here. As darkness fell, flares lit up the horizon again. Somewhere out there, another unit was in contact. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the valley, faint but familiar. It reminded us that it never stopped. The war didn't pause for grief. It didn't wait for anyone to catch their breath. When I lay down that night, I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, the explosion replayed again. The flash, the sound, the way the world shook, and then Harris's hand twitching before it went still. My chest tightened with a kind of guilt I couldn't name. Survivor's guilt, they called it later. But out there, it just felt like failure. Days passed, but the weight didn't lift. It pressed harder, quietly, invisibly. The routine resumed. Briefings, patrols, repairs, but beneath it all, something had changed. A part of the team was missing, and the gap he left behind couldn't be filled by repetition or orders. The war has a way of hardening you, of building walls around the parts that hurt most. But even the strongest walls crack eventually, and when they do, the silence rushes in. On the 5th night after the ambush, I woke suddenly. For a moment, I thought I'd heard Harris's voice, soft, distant, like an echo from the other side of a dream. I sat up, heart racing, the tent dark except for the flicker of a lantern outside. It was just the wind, I told myself, just the wind moving through the canvas. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the wind. It was memory, alive, heavy, and unrelenting. That was the weight of silence. It didn't scream, it didn't rage, it just stayed, day after day, pressing on your chest until you forgot what it felt like to breathe freely. And though the world around me kept moving, patrols continued, radios crackled, engines roared, the silence inside me never left. It was there when I closed my eyes. It was there when I woke. And in that silence, a question began to grow. One I didn't yet have the courage to face. Why had I survived when he hadn't? The days after Harris's death blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next. Time in Afghanistan had always been fluid, stretching, folding, disappearing. But now it felt hollow. The base moved on as it always did. Trucks rolled in and out, soldiers prepped gear, orders were given and followed. But beneath the rhythm of duty, there was something heavier, quieter, a kind of shared grief that no one dared to name. The squad was smaller now, not just in numbers, but in spirit. Every man felt the absence. Harris's cot sat empty, his gear stacked neatly by the tent wall. No one touched it. In this place, you didn't take down a fallen brother's things right away. You left them as they were, for a while. Maybe as a sign of respect. Maybe as a way of pretending he might walk through the door again. Valdez took it the hardest. He was the kind of leader who carried everyone's burdens, even the ones that weren't his to carry. Since that morning, he'd been different, quieter, more deliberate. Every time we geared up for another patrol, his eyes lingered a little longer on each of us, like he was memorizing our faces. The kind of look that said he was preparing himself for loss. We went back out 3 days later. The mission was simple on paper: clear a route along the western edge of the valley, gather intel, maintain presence. But simple didn't mean safe. Every step out there carried the echo of what had happened. The same mountains surrounded us, the same roads stretched out ahead. It was impossible not to think about the crater that had swallowed Harris. We all did. The locals watched us from a distance again, their faces unreadable. Children peered from behind doorways. Men stood in the fields pretending to work. We didn't know who among them had planted that IED, who had watched it happen, who had stayed silent. The line between friend and enemy was always blurred. Out here, trust wasn't given. It was rationed, like water. As we walked, the dust rose around our boots, thick and golden under the midday sun. The air shimmered with heat. It was quiet. Too quiet again. That same feeling crept in, the one from the morning of the blast. The air felt charged, like the whole valley was holding its breath. Valdez raised his hand, signaling a halt. We dropped to a knee, scanning our sectors, eyes sweeping the ridgelines. My heart thudded in my chest. The world seemed to narrow to a pinpoint. The sound of my own breath, the weight of the rifle in my hands, the silence pressing against my ears. Then, faintly, from somewhere ahead, a sound. Not the thunder of an explosion this time, but something smaller. A cough, a rustle of fabric. We advanced slowly, every muscle tense, until we saw him. A boy, maybe 12 years old, sitting in the shade of a crumbled wall. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dust. He didn't move when he saw us, just stared, wide-eyed but calm. Something about his expression made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't fear, it was resignation. Valdez signaled me forward. I moved cautiously, scanning the ground ahead for wires, disturbed soil, anything that looked wrong. There was nothing. Just the boy, and a faint smell of smoke. He was holding something in his lap, a small metal box covered in dirt. My stomach dropped. I shouted for everyone to hold position, and Valdez moved up beside me. We froze. The boy didn't flinch. He looked down at the box, then back at us, eyes empty, as if he understood exactly what it was. The EOD tech moved in, slow and steady, his movements rehearsed and calm. We pulled back, rifles up, waiting. The minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, the tech waved his hand. Safe. The box was a decoy. A test, maybe. A message. Valdez's jaw tightened. Whoever had planted that fake device had known we'd come this way. They were watching us again, measuring our reaction, waiting for the next real strike. This was their way of saying, "We're still here." We moved on, but the mood had shifted. Every shadow felt alive, every sound suspicious. The valley was taunting us. By the time we made it back to base, the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting everything in the same red hue as the dust on our boots. That night, after debrief, we gathered by the burn pit. It wasn't official, but it had become something of a ritual, a way to talk without talking. The flames crackled, throwing light across tired faces. The smell of smoke and diesel filled the air. Someone passed around a canteen, and for a moment it almost felt normal. The kind of brotherhood that only comes from walking through fire together. We didn't speak about Harris directly, but he was there, in every silence, in every look that lingered too long on the fire. Valdez finally broke the quiet, not with words of command, but with something softer. He started talking about home, about a fishing trip he never took, about his brother's wedding he'd missed. One by one, the others followed. Stories about childhood, about things that seemed small but mattered now more than ever. We weren't talking about war anymore. We were talking about life, the kind we missed, the kind we hoped to see again. As the night deepened, I realized something. Out there, beyond the wire, we were soldiers, trained, armed, unflinching. But here, around that fire, we were just men trying to remember who we'd been before all this. The laughter that eventually came wasn't joy, it was release, the sound of men fighting off the darkness for one more night. Before turning in, Valdez pulled something from his pocket. Harris's name tape. He'd kept it since the medevac. He placed it in the fire without a word. The flames curled around it, blackening the edges before consuming it completely. No speech, no ceremony, just fire and silence. That was how soldiers said goodbye. Later, lying in my bunk, I thought about that moment. The way the flames had danced against the darkness, the way the ashes had drifted upward, carried by the wind. I wondered if they'd reach the valley, if somehow Harris could see them. We were brothers in the dust, bound by blood and loss, by the things we couldn't say and the things we could never forget. The war wasn't over for us. It never really was. But in that moment, by that fire, we found something rare. A brief peace in the chaos. And deep down, I knew that the next time we went out there, every one of us would carry a piece of Harris with us. Not in words, not in memory, but in the quiet understanding that his sacrifice had become part of who we were. Still, I couldn't shake one thought, the feeling that something worse was coming. The morning after the fire felt different. The air was cooler, the light softer, almost reluctant to touch the earth. The mountains stood still, silent witnesses to everything that had passed. For a few fleeting moments, it almost felt peaceful again. But peace, I'd learned, was never more than a disguise here, a thin veil stretched over something waiting to break. Orders came down before sunrise, another patrol, another route, another chance for the valley to test us. The mission was familiar: secure a road, make contact with locals, gather intel, but the familiarity didn't make it easier. Each time we stepped outside the wire, it felt like walking back into a memory that refused to stay buried. Valdez led the briefing, calm as always, his voice steady, his tone clipped. But I could see the fatigue in his eyes, the weight he carried since Harris's death. We all saw it. Still, none of us said a word. Out here, you didn't talk about the weight. You just carried it. The patrol moved out just as the first rays of light crept across the valley floor. The world glowed gold and red, the kind of beauty that hurt to look at, the kind of beauty that mocked you. The dust kicked up behind us, trailing like smoke. The sound of boots on gravel echoed faintly, a steady rhythm that kept the fear from getting too loud. We passed through the same village as before, the same faces, the same silence. The same boy stood by the road, this time holding a bundle of sticks instead of a jug. He didn't wave. He didn't move. Just watched us go. I wondered what he thought of us, if he saw soldiers or ghosts. The road wound up toward a narrow pass, a stretch of rock and dirt that overlooked the river basin, the kind of terrain that offered no cover and nowhere to run. Every man felt it, the exposure, the tension, the knowledge that this was where ambushes were born. Still, we pressed on because that's what soldiers do. You move forward even when every instinct tells you to stop. Halfway through the pass, the radio crackled. Faint static, then a broken transmission from base. Words cutting in and out. Possible movement, East Ridge, stay alert. That was all we needed to hear. The formation tightened. Eyes scanned the slopes. Hands gripped rifles a little tighter. The first shot came from somewhere above. A single crack that split the morning air, followed by the sharp hiss of a bullet skipping off rock. Then came the chorus, rifle fire from both sides echoing across the pass. Dust erupted around us. We dove for what little cover there was, Shallow dips, boulders, anything. The ambush had come again, sudden and absolute. The fight was fierce and fast. Muzzle flashes lit the ridges, shadows moving behind them like ghosts. Valdez barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. We returned fire, short, controlled bursts, trying to find targets in the haze. The valley came alive again with sound, gunfire, shouting, the dull thud of grenades rolling across dirt. I found myself beside Valdez, pinned behind a jagged rock that barely shielded us. He was calm, methodical, scanning, firing, moving. The kind of composure only earned through too many close calls. But then came the sound that froze us both. A scream, sharp and sudden, from down the line. One of ours was hit. Private Dawson, young, barely 20. The medic scrambled toward him, bullets cutting through the air around him. Valdez didn't hesitate. He moved to cover the medic, stepping into open ground, firing as he went. The rest of us laid down suppressive fire, the noise deafening. I shouted for him to fall back, though I don't know if he heard me. He reached Dawson, dragged him behind a rock, then turned to cover the retreat. That's when it happened. A burst from the ridge, a split second of movement, and Valdez staggered. A round caught him in the chest, spinning him back against the dirt. The sound around me disappeared. The gunfire dulled to a distant hum. All I could hear was my own breath. I crawled toward him, dragging myself through the dust, the world narrowing to a tunnel of light and sound. When I reached him, his eyes were open, staring at the sky. His breathing was shallow, ragged. He tried to speak, but no words came, just a faint exhale. His hand gripped mine, tight, desperate. Then it loosened. The light in his eyes faded, and just like that, the man who had carried us all was gone. The firefight raged on, but I didn't hear it anymore. The world had gone silent again. That same unbearable silence that had followed Harris's death. Only this time, it felt heavier. Final. We fought our way out of the pass, dragging Dawson with us, leaving behind another piece of ourselves on that cursed ground. The ambush eventually broke. The enemy melted back into the hills, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. By the time reinforcements arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the rocks. The light turned everything gold again, beautiful and cruel. I remember kneeling beside Valdez's body, the last light of day falling across his face. There was peace there, real peace, the kind none of us had found while alive. Back at base, the silence returned. No words, no ceremony, just the quiet rhythm of routine trying to fill the void. The others moved like ghosts through the tents, their eyes empty, their hands mechanical. We'd lost our leader, our anchor, and in losing him, we'd lost the last illusion that any of us were untouchable. That night, I sat outside alone, staring at the horizon. The stars came out one by one, sharp and cold. Somewhere beyond them was home. But home felt farther than ever. I thought about Harris, about Valdez, about the boy with the jug, and the valley that never slept. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. It lingers, in your chest, in your head, in the spaces between your thoughts. It waits for you in the quiet. It waits for you when the lights go out. The next morning, I packed my gear for the last time. My deployment was over. The day I'd been counting down to for months had come, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like leaving something unfinished. As the helicopter lifted off, the valley stretched beneath us, endless, silent, unforgiving. From above, the roads looked like scars cut into the earth, the same paths we'd walked, the same trails where friends had fallen. I stared down until the valley disappeared behind the horizon. And for the first time, I realized the truth. You don't leave a place like that behind. It leaves pieces of itself in you. When I got home, people asked what it was like. I told them it was hot, dusty, hard. That we did our jobs. That we came back. But I never told them about the silence. I never told them about Harris or Valdez or the boy with the empty eyes. Some stories I learned belong to the dust. Now, years later, I still wake before dawn sometimes, caught between memory and dream. And for a moment, I'm back there. The sun just rising, the world still calm, the day not yet broken, the day everything changed.